Good evening, Canby and Canby City Council and 1/7 of the Planning Commission. We are here this evening as part of our Canby City Council meeting for a work session to discuss small cell technology and a 5G draft ordinance. So we're gonna get a lowdown on that this evening and discuss some design standard options and whatnot go so that we will adopt to be able to move forward with the 5G process. So I'm going to turn it over to City Hall, and I believe Joe, I'll let you take care of introductions from there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, here we have from our planning department, Mr. Eric Forcell, who's going to take you through all of the design stuff, and that's kind of the focus of this workshop. And if you have legal questions, I'll be sitting in the back waiting to eagerly answer, but otherwise, he has a presentation that he's ready to present for you.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening, councilors and Mr. Mayor and Planning Commissioner, I think. Still.
We have two now.
Planning Commissioners. Like Joe said, this is intended to be kind of a high-level overview of the proposed telecommunication code amendments. They are basically at I would say like an 85% completion rate, and we wanted to get these in front of both the Planning Commission and the City Council to review and provide comment on, make sure that this seems like an appropriate path forward, and to collect any kind of thoughts or revisions or questions at this point. And I just wanted to start with a brief overview with this PowerPoint, so I'll continue the next slide here. First, why are we talking about this? So, as mentioned in a memorandum that I sent, the usage of cell phones and data specifically is continued to expand at an exponential rate. And as part of that, telecommunications companies are looking for new ways to address this demand. And one of those ways is the microcell phenomenon. Microcells, again, are much smaller deployments of telecommunications facilities. They're not your typical large cell phone tower. They can be placed on, like in this example, telephone pole or other poles, sometimes on structures. So that's why we're talking about these changes today. It's important to note that without any design standards and application requirements, that telecommunications companies could likely install facilities without any review from Canby staff via building permit with Clackamas County. It's important that we get in front of this and have some reasonable time, place, and manner standards that work both within the confines of federal law, are an efficient method for staff to review, and are reasonable for the telecommunications companies themselves. So again, why are we talking about this? Federal laws and regulations severely hamper or limit the local jurisdiction from prohibiting the deployment of small cell installations. So an outright ban would be very unlikely, if not impossible. And I do think that's been attempted in larger jurisdictions pending litigation, but pretty much the way the federal law is written today is that an outright ban or the effect of an outright ban is not going to work for the city of Canby. These are basically the 4 laws and regulations that dictate the playbook for dealing with telecommunications facilities. The important components are basically that local jurisdictions will try to create a fair playing field for all telecommunications facilities. There's some shot clock requirements, which is a colloquialism for the time required for a jurisdiction, or in this example, the city of Canby, to make a decision on an application. They can be pretty quick. For many of these, it would be 60 days from the day that an application hits our door and for staff to render a yes or a no decision. As we move forward in time from 1934 to most recently in 2018 with the FCC small cell order, it basically, to summarize, just limits the ability of a local jurisdiction to regulate, restrict, or try to delay the process of the installation of any kind of telecommunications equipment. The new phenomenon now is these small cell facilities. So again, why are we talking about this now? Because a lot of these newer generation telecommunications equipment facilities are deployed in the right of way, and they're a lot smaller scale than traditional cell towers. So we're going to be seeing potentially more of these, but they're not going to be shrouded in a field somewhere. They might be in the actual urban infrastructure. It's still not super clear to the extent that they will be deployed in the city of Canby. I imagine that's based on the potential providers, basically math or analysis on the benefit of placing them in Canby. But I imagine at some point in time, these providers will come to Canby seeking to deploy these smaller cell telecommunications facilities. On the left-hand side of your screen is an example of what a small cell facility looks like deployed on a streetlight. And then on the right side is what most of us would attribute with a larger, like, macro cell phone tower. So what are we proposing as staff as part of this? The first item is to remove the telecommunications section from the general portion of the code as it exists today, and to create its own section. And that would include macro telecommunications, so cell phone towers, and micro, the smaller ones that we're talking about. I think partly this is to make it nice and clear for everybody to know where it is that we need to go to evaluate a cell phone tower or a small cell facility being deployed in the city of Canby.
You're talking about removing this chapter 16, what's currently in chapter 16?
And putting it in.
But chapter 12 still remains.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So,
yeah. And none of it's being deleted. It's more like a housekeeping, and that's an important component. It's a housekeeping effort to make it a little easier to see a code and know where a Verizon or AT&T or whoever can go to find the code that's applicable to what they're trying to do. Yeah, so I think that's really all that I'll say about that part. The text amendments themselves are intended to allow the city to regulate the development of telecommunications facilities in the public right-of-way, on public property and private real property. The only major change there is the regulation of telecommunications facilities within the public right-of-way. That's not something that has typically been done in the past in any kind of large scale. The next goal is to ensure that the code amendments themselves are at a low risk of legal challenge and are consistent with federal law. I think in prior experience in working in other jurisdictions, it's quite common that these telecommunications companies come with heavy budgets, lots of attorneys, and they're ready to mount a legal challenge if your code does not meet the law. And when I say law, I mean federal law. That's not to say that we don't provide some reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions that fall in line with federal law. And that goes to my last point, that the requirements and restrictions will allow for them to deploy new telecommunications facilities, but also reduce the impacts to the citizens of Canby and other passers-byers in the right of way.
Can I jump in just for 2 seconds?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Hey, this is Joe really fast, and we had a sidebar here for 2 seconds, and so I wanted to make sure that it made the record for you guys for this, mostly because if there's other planning commissioners who might come in and hear this in the aftermath if they didn't hear it now, which is Chapter 16, the planning code, has currently some code, and that is what Mr. Forcell is saying. We're going to try to take that out and put it all into one place in Chapter 16. There is a Chapter 12 telecommunications code that we operate with our cable franchises and our telephone franchises. That will still exist. And so a telecommunications company will have to know about both of them, because Chapter 16 is more about the design standards, right? And Chapter 12 is more about kind of the legal and the franchise requirements. So just so everybody's on the same page there.
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. And so these are the last three components, is to include the important shot clock requirements, which I had already mentioned, regarding the time it required to process an application that hits our door and subsequently leaves with either an approval or a denial. As part of the code amendments itself, there is language providing standardized application and review process. This is both for the applicant and for staff. So everybody's working from the same playbook on what's required and what's needed for staff to review an application and process it. And then lastly, which is standard for most code language, is including severability clauses should the law, rules, or precedents change, which in this type of dynamic setting, that could happen. So how did these changes get crafted? The model code and code changes that are presented in front of you today came from the National Association of Cities, the League of Oregon Cities, Oregon City, which we had previously discussed in a prior meeting, and a little bit from Lane County. I wanted to mention this is because I think it's important to note that staff didn't craft this out of thin air. We used pretty reputable associations and other jurisdictions to build this code and then to tailor it to the city of Canby. A lot of work was done by those various bodies, and a lot of it was vetted by attorneys as well. So I think it's a pretty sound model code. The code, again, is meant to be legally defensible while still allowing for regulations. And as I mentioned earlier, it appears that there are stricter versions of codes that are out there. One in particular is in San Francisco, and that's undergoing a pretty fierce legal battle. And I'm not sure that that's what the city of Canby is trying to do. So the purpose of our meeting today is, again, kind of a high-level code review. I note again that the document that we submitted is still a draft, and that staff wanted to make sure that the Planning Commission and the City Council were informed on what we were doing. Also, I wanted to allow an opportunity for questions from both the Council and the Planning Commission for staff, noting that if it's something super detailed, I may need to do a bit of research, but I'm happy to field questions about the overall process or what's been presented to you thus far. And then to accept some recommendations and directions from both bodies before we launch into the formal text amendment process, which would be presenting the text amendments at Planning Commission and then subsequently requesting we move forward up to the City Council for ultimate approval via ordinance. So again, we're trying to, our staff is trying to make sure that we're all kind of working from the same page, that you're not surprised by what we present in the future, and that's at both bodies, both at the Planning Commission and at the City Council. So with that, that's my high level overview. I do want to stress that it's important that we get some kind of code in place. And I think what we have today is a pretty good draft version. It's definitely not finalized. But if there's things that you see that are major issues or are very confusing or don't appear to make sense, I think this would be a good time to relay those. That way we can address them and ultimately have a better package for both the Planning Commission and subsequently the City Council moving forward. The other item that I would mention is right now we are shooting for an early October Planning Commission date. That is the earliest we would be able to do that because of the 35-day noticing requirement to the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So that would be the earliest Planning Commission date. And so that kind of gives you an idea of next steps thus far. So I guess at this point, I will ask or answer any questions that either the council or commission have for me or for Joe, and hopefully be able to provide some clarity on anything that's confusing.
I have a question. The version of the 3 cubic foot boxes are the ones that go up high. Do you have any idea what the ratio is between the 3 cubic foot and the 28 cubic foot apparatus? I mean, does it go from like every corner? Are we going to have a refrigerator sitting on it, or is it that they put in one and that runs 20 of the smaller ones?
So just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, the 3 cubic volume apparatuses and the 28 cubic feet or cubic feet volume. So the 3 cubic feet is, from my understanding, is the actual antenna itself. The 28 cubic feet is the maximum allowed per federal law for the what quote unquote ancillary equipment. And what that means is distribution box, cooling box, any other equipment that is required to actually project the wireless signal. Part of the code is intended to strongly encourage these wireless providers to locate that equipment underground, if possible, or to shroud it by other means if it must remain above ground.
Is it per unit, like, does each antenna have to have the larger portion, or is it, the larger portion covers several? Like streetlights, they've got one utility box that covers however many streetlights. Do you know?
I'm not 100% positive on how that gets deployed for a telecommunications company, but it's my understanding from the material I've read that you're not going to see 128 cubic feet volume apparatus for each antenna.
Okay.
And I'm fairly certain about that. The other thing that's I think is pretty important with that is that they can't place those facilities in a way that would obstruct the sidewalk block ADA access, or otherwise hamper or place motorists, pedestrians, or other people that are walking within the right of way. So it's going to be challenging even for the telecommunications company to place those in a way that will work for them and for the city. So to answer your question, I do not believe we're going to see a proliferation of 28 cubic feet volume ancillary equipment throughout the city.
Okay, just wanted to double check because it wasn't clear from what I had read or from our prior meeting.
I've done a little research about that. This is Commissioner Hutchinson.
Sir.
There are two kinds of antennas. The smaller ones are kind of omnidirectional, and the antennas are housed inside their box. I've done some reading about some larger ones, which are actually a grid of little tiny antennas that, if you add a couple of them together vertically or horizontally, that you can get, twice the distance out of it. And those will work really well for line of sight conditions, like alongside highways. And they look like giant prisms, like three-sided prisms standing on end. And those can be some of the larger ones, but it's really dependent on line of sight. And so, when you're talking within the city where there's trees and other structures, you're going to end up seeing the smaller ones more frequently.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Barbara, you got a question?
Yeah, Eric, my question has to do with, do these units all work between all of the different companies, or will one unit only work for one specific company? Meaning, are we going to see 3 and 4 antennas on a pole, being, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, whatever? And then in addition to that, with any of the boxes that might come out as a part of that, are we going to start seeing a bunch of those boxes sitting next to each other as well?
Thanks for the question, Councillor Varwig. So typically the way these work, and again, I'm not a telecommunications guru guy, but the way the code is written is to strongly encourage, if not require, these companies to do what's called co-location. So the idea there is that we have as many of the antennas as possible on as little poles as possible. So really we want to see not a lot of poles, and that means not building a lot of new poles, and that equipment going on to a couple of poles rather than spread out through many different poles, if that makes sense. So the co-location requirement is asking providers to place their antennas on a structure that already has other antennas. As far as companies sharing antennas, I don't think that's probably standard practice.
Just to add to that, Councillor Barwig, when I was dealing with Verizon about a year ago, when they were talking about potentially coming in, and there was another mobility as well, they were at first talking about having a couple of these, maybe 5 or 6 in a web. But they were definitely talking about, one company was talking about basically, cherry picking the plum areas and then trying to sell the signal. Another one was talking only about giving to their customers only. So I think there is a different strategy for different companies out there. But we don't have any yet, and so it's going to be hard to know who does what. That's why we're trying to get ahead of them.
Perfect, because the last thing I want to do is just see a bunch of, poles lined up down the street with different cell phone companies, small cell tower on each one. I just don't want to see that happening.
That's correct, and that is the kind of the intent of the way this code is written, is to guide that telecommunications company to co-locate whenever possible. And if they do absolutely have to build a new pole, they have to give us the reasoning behind that. They can't just arbitrarily say we need to construct a new pole. They have to provide some objective evidence in an application that shows why that would need to happen. So I would agree with you.
How would that work in a community where they've successfully moved all the infrastructure underground and there were no poles? Would it just be light poles then at that point?
Commissioner Hutchinson, I can maybe try to answer that. This is Joe Lindsay. What's interesting about we have competing chapters, and Chapter 12 calls for everything telecommunications to be underground. So my first kind of conversations with everyone is you're going to have to get special permission to go above ground, obviously with cell towers and things like that, and the FCC ruling or order that says we can't be obstructionist. So clearly we're going to have to let them go above ground. So in a case where there's nothing, absolutely nothing above ground, they attach them to buildings and everything else. So if that kind of answers your question, they're going to have to go above ground, and the FCC says we can't stop them from doing so unrealistically. So sadly, that's kind of the legal answer.
Thank you.
Jeff, and then Councillor Parker.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I want to apologize for joining late. I failed to read my emails correctly. I guess I wanted to start off. I have a couple of requests, but first I wanted to start off by complimenting staff on the work that's been done. Given all the challenges they've been facing, I think this is a really good point to be at, and I look forward to the Planning Commission work sessions. With that, along with that, I also really want to support the idea of creating the new dedicated chapter for telecommunications. It's a great idea, and I think it'll really help with clarity in the code. Having said that, in reading the code, I'd encourage staff to ensure that each section of code, it's clear whether we're talking macro or micro. I think there could be some communication in areas where we've transplanted code. I saw a couple of places where I know I got confused, which isn't saying much perhaps, but I'd encourage them to take another look at that with a strong eye towards making sure that we know what we're talking about, what this particular piece of code is addressing. Is it addressing macro? Is it addressing micro? In most cases, it's pretty clear, but there are a few cases where it's not. And then finally, I think the work, I look forward to the rest of the work. Most of it's, I see several things that I have questions on, but I don't think that for this high level, they're more syntactical and definition type work. So I'll end my comments with that. And once again, want to thank staff.
Thank you, Commissioner Mills.
Councillor Parker?
Yeah, I'm glad Jeff mentioned that. This is an excellent staff report. I appreciate the depth, and we're lucky that Eric actually had some experience in this area in Lane County, where they have already had to begin work on it. Just a couple things real high level. The fee structure that you used as an example from Oregon City, for me, that looks fine. We've already brought up the undergrounding and having wires above ground, which I think everyone knows how I feel about that. On bottom of page 15, and our city attorney and our city manager both agree that there is some language there on when a provider thinks they have no option but to underground it, or excuse me, to be above ground, and that the FCC wouldn't let us delay it. I think part of the metric there is how do you have a defensible argument that you have to have it above ground? Is it going to cost you more money? I don't care. I just think I think as we move into 5G and we're talking about having wires overhead back to the 19th century, it's absurd. So everything that we can do to try and encourage undergrounding, including the possibility, Eric, of looking at language where the application for an exception, and I would want it to be an exception. An application for an exception wouldn't be subject to the 60-day rule, if that was at all possible. There's a loophole in there that I already see that we could use. I don't really want to do it. That the clock doesn't start until the planning director determines that the file is complete and adequate. We could send the planning director to Montana for a week and the clock wouldn't start then. But I'd rather for us to play it above board here and say it's the policy of the city of Canby not to have wires above board, to have as few of these things as possible. And then finally, on page 23, after a year, these units could be declared abandoned and removed. And I'm always trying to look down the road of in 20 years, what is that city council going to be annoyed that we did? And one of them is if they've got a bunch of these old junky pieces of technology lying around town, and Jerry has to get on a ladder and unhook them and drag them down. There is a provision here about a bond. There's always the question of what good is a bond if a company's gone out of business. So, Eric, to the extent that you can try and tighten that up as much as you can, that we know this isn't going to be the last technology. That in what, Tim, 5 years, this is going to probably be abandoned, and we're going to end up with these old boxes lying around town. And I sure want the people who put them in to take them down.
Great points, Greg. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. I also agree with the undergrounding component for sure. I think that if we can encourage or / require them to place as much of their equipment as possible underground and hold the line on that, money not necessarily being the driving factor, I think that would be a reasonable way to regulate some of this development. As also regarding the removal component, at Lane County, we had this provision for wireless equipment because of the exact phenomenon that you described. Equipment would go up, it never was used sparingly, and people would disappear, and it was left basically untended. So I think it would be good to include that section and to bolster it. My recollection of how that worked in Lane County was that there were some questions about tying the bond to the removal, and I can definitely explore that more as we move forward with the Planning Commission, at least for the first step. So.
And I could augment that a little. The idea that our current telecommunications chapter 12 requires that if somebody is basically vacating their franchise agreement, then they have to remove their facilities. I think it's within 90 days in chapter 12. So most of the time, I'm hoping to make sure that people who put this stuff up are under a franchise agreement. And so that will govern as well.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Council President Dale.
Yeah, Joe or Eric, are we compelled that if a 5G company wants to use one of our, say, streetlight poles, are we compelled to allow them to do it? I totally get that we might be incented to do it, right? So that they don't put up a pole of their own. I'm just curious if we're required to.
This is Eric. Thanks for the question, Councillor Dale. So I'd say the simple answer is yes and no. We're required to allow the provision or ability to place their equipment in the city. I think there is some leeway, which Oregon City included in their version of code that basically says, we want you to put it everywhere but there first. So how does that work? So we could say, we want you to find a location anywhere but that particular street light. And if that works for your service, then that's where we would want you to put it. And that's my understanding of basically how that works in terms of deployment. And I think Joe has a little bit to add.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so Oregon City says, they have some of their fancy kind of old, classic looking lights that they excluded in their code. I would say, and one of the reasons we're here is we get a good shot at making a code that has design standards that can be easily applied and easily known. So if you don't want things on our old-fashioned looking lights, we should put it in so they don't even ask, because then they'll go for something else that's nearby, and that'll be the application. We only have 60 days to decide in many cases. So that's why we're here, is if there seems to be a stomach only to make sure that we have a carve out like that, this would be a perfect time to say, yeah, we don't want them on our nice looking old fashioned pools. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we're here, because we would want to codify that instead of just take it a case by case basis.
Yeah, I think we'd be very interested in that. We have some historical feel areas. We've invested millions of dollars in the First and Second Street, and I would like to protect that aesthetically if at all possible. Also regarding aesthetics, there was some mention of it there in the code, but what's really our control over private property, right? So here I've just said I don't want them on First and Second Street, but do we have any control over them just putting it on the Graham building or putting a pole 6 inches back from the right of way into a front lawn?
That's this is Eric again. That's a great question. And part of the reason that this code is crafted the way it is that it's intended to encompass both the public right-of-way, private property, and public property. So a lot of versions of this code, they, in my opinion, do not include an important component, which is private property. So these can be deployed on structures like you had mentioned. And I think this code attempts to also place the same design standards onto private property as it does public right-of-way, with the intent of the deployer not just skirting the issue, saying, okay, I'll avoid the public right-of-way, but I'll go ahead and attach this to that private structure, which is 6 inches out of the right-of-way, and then gets to avoid any kind of concealment requirements, volumetric requirements, height, etc. And that, the way this code is written, is intended to place some time, place, and manner restrictions on the deployment of these micro cells on private structures as well.
Okay, good to hear. I would encourage, if it's not already explicit, that in our code that we can make sure we obey the aggregate height standard limitations we have. For instance, classic example, you can't put a 5G cell tower on top of the dahlia if it's above 60 feet. Is that possible?
Yes, that's possible. There are also baked in basically height restriction standards in the code that's presented today, intended to basically avoid that exact phenomenon of let's find the tallest structure around and then put our antenna on top of that. So I think that's a good point, and I think I'll include some more explicit language about that exact description.
Just a couple more quick things. If I could, Eric, I'd like you to check into, and I think I probably have a sympathetic ear with Councillor Parker. You know, I don't want to be a hard guy about this. I I'm willing to have a lot of latitude for special events, right? Everything from, I'm really not going to fuss if for the duration of the fair, somebody wants to bring in a mobile 5G, okay? So that people have great coverage on the fairgrounds for a week. I'm fine with that. That doesn't bug me a bit. I think it's a cool service, makes our fair more attractive. And also emergency things. Obviously none of us are going to have a problem if somebody starts wheeling in some temporary 5Gs in case of an emergency, especially if the cell tower networks are suffering or whatever. I just want to make sure that we're cool on that. Not that I can imagine we prosecute that anyway. And then kind of my closer, I just want to echo Councillor Parker's earlier concerns about overheading. I'm thinking back to, we basically kept the free county broadband out of Canby by playing the no overhead card. And we played that strongly, and their objection was, well, we can't afford to come in unless you let us go overhead. And we said, well, we're sorry, but that's our code. So we do have a strong precedent that we have set there. And I'm not sure where we'll stand after this because of the federal regulations. But there was a mention in there about, boy, whatever you do, keep the playing field as even as you can and document the deviations. And that's it, Mr. Mayor.
No, I appreciate
think
that.
the answer a little bit to that is that the FCC order does basically start to side with whomever wants to do whatever they want against that idea, and claim that, that jacking the price up does effectively, if it makes it impossible for them to do it by cutting into their bottom line, then it becomes unreasonable per se. So we are trying to be as reasonable as possible, but not completely roll over. The other idea between public and private that I wanted to mention was in the industry right now, it seems to be that they try first to go to the public right away because the FCC order is making it cheaper for them. So if they hooked up to private people, the private people can charge them more and such. So there is kind of a competing interest. I'm not sure you're going to see, if we follow a kind of a somewhat reasonable route, they will probably come to us unless they find somebody who's so cheap on private land that, doesn't get in their way. They'll still have to follow at least these design standards, which is good.
Thank you, sir.
Sure. Any other comments, questions? So Eric and Joe, what are next steps here from this?
This is Eric again, Mr. Mayor. Next steps would be to schedule a planning commission meeting and to notice the appropriate parties, one being state, of the intent to amend the text of our code. And from there, tighten up what we have now, include some of the comments that we've received today, and then propose the changes formally in front of the Planning Commission in October, early October. And assuming we get a positive response from the Planning Commission, we would then set a time and date certain for first reading in front of the City Council.
Okay. So moving right along. Commissioner Mills, question, comment?
Yeah, just a quick question for Eric. I just want to make sure that we're thinking that there is going to be a planning commission work session before the final approval session. Is that what I heard?
I mean, if you want to go earlier.
This is Eric, Commissioner Mills. I need to speak with Ryan about our plan on that. The idea is that hopefully we can have this buttoned up to a point where it makes sense to present the documents to you in a hearing format. But I would like to bounce that off of Ryan, the senior planner first, and then definitely keep in touch with the planning commission to let them know our intent. We have a few days. The part of the issue here is that I think from what I've heard from Joe is that we're under the gun, so to speak, a little bit here from the providers wanting to potentially install equipment in Canby, and absent any kind of code, we're going to be left with no way to regulate this. So,
Reason I ask is I think there's an open meeting window in September, and I just, I'm sitting here, I let a lot of little things go by because they're little things, and I don't think we need to bother everyone with them at this meeting, but I mean, we've got some organizational, definitional type things I'd like to make sure we get through before it's put to public hearing. So, I mean, I can, if we can work out some method where we can get our inputs to you based on what we're reading, this being the planning commission, if you're going to go straight to hearing, I think I'd caution you to try to get it to us, get our input before you go to hearing.
So this is Eric again, Commissioner Mills. So I think we're both talking about the same thing. I think we'd like to maintain a hearing in October, but I think scheduling a work session in between is a feasible goal. But I'd like to ensure that we're setting a date certain to get that hearing going in October. But in the intermediary, I think that in late September, we could have a work session with the Planning Commission.
That'd be my hope.
I think that makes sense, and I think that's reasonable, and I think staff can accommodate that. So,
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Mills. I appreciate that. I think, yeah, you can never have something like this. I don't think you can have too many work sessions on to make sure it's vetted correctly, because I think, as Eric stated, or may have been Council President Dale, that when you're looking at if we create something incorrectly, or maybe try to pull a fast one, the gaggle of attorneys that the telecommunication companies may have would make our city attorney's job a little difficult for a while. So I think all the pieces that we're bringing up here, I think, are worth going back and making sure we're vetting well. Especially we talk about going below ground versus above ground, those kinds of things. I think, Tim, the piece you brought up about being able to pop things up, temporary 5G piece for an event or something is great. I think that the wording around that to make sure that something that's temporary doesn't become a permanent fixture somewhere. So making sure that we've got the right verbiage in there so that doesn't happen. I think an additional work session for the Planning Commission might be a good idea. Any other comments, questions? Seeing head shaking from some of the councilors. The Planning Commission is incognito this evening, so unless I see microphones go off or hands go up in the participant window, I think we're going to call this a good work session. Eric, anything that we should have asked that we didn't?
I don't think so at this time. There were good questions and good feedback. I do think the inclusion of provisions for emergency response is a solid idea, as well as temporary provisions for events that happen frequently in Canby when we're in a little bit normal state of time. So I think those are an example of some items that we could add as well. And I do really appreciate the feedback and the time.
Well, you did a great staff report. It was very well done and presented well. So we really appreciate that, especially when we're dealing with such a heady topic with just an hour to digest it. So I appreciate that tremendously. Okay, if we've got nothing else for this piece, Eric, thank you, appreciate it. Planning Commissioners, Trundy, Hutchinson, and Mills, thank you for being on. Really appreciate it. It was good to chat with you. I would say see you, but you're not there. So thank you all. The council will end this work session, and council will be back in about 8 minutes for our council meeting. Thanks, everyone, and talk to everyone soon.